Good evening. Tonight we're stepping into a room you didn't know you'd been living in your whole life, a room lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not just your face, but pieces of your soul you've been quietly tiptoeing around. You probably wouldn't survive this if it was a physical place. Too many sharp edges of truth to bump into, but thankfully, we're just talking about your inner world here. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. I used to think relationships were accidents, little random crossings of paths that either worked or didn't. But the older I get, the more I realize there's nothing random about them. Every person who has stirred something powerful in me, good or bad, was holding up a mirror. Sometimes it was a mirror I adored, showing me warmth, charm, adventure. Other times, it was a mirror I wanted to smash because I didn't like what I saw staring back. And that's the tricky thing. These reflections aren't about them. They're about me. There was this one friend, years ago, who drove me mad. She was always late. She told stories that made her the hero, and she had this strange, effortless way of making people forgive her for everything. At first, I chalked it up to arrogance. Then, much later, I realized my irritation had less to do with her and more to do with the fact that I'd never given myself permission to be unapologetically confident. That was the first time I caught my own reflection in someone else's behavior. It was uncomfortable, like discovering the spinach in your teeth during a first date, but it was also oddly liberating. Old age wisdom says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I've come to believe the teacher often wears the face of someone we either love or can't stand. A quirky fact. Apparently, our brains light up in similar ways when we see someone we're deeply drawn to and when we see someone who triggers us. Attraction and irritation are two ends of the same electric wire, both jolting us awake to something important. Academics would call this a projection of the shadow self, but I just call it the universe's less than subtle way of getting our attention. It's funny how blind we can be to our own patterns. I used to say, why do I keep ending up with people like this? As if it was some cosmic prank. But looking back, the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. I kept being drawn to the same qualities because I hadn't yet faced the parts of myself they were reflecting. I wanted to think I was a completely self-aware person. Turns out, I was just self-aware about the parts of me I liked. Imagine you're carrying a backpack filled with stuff you've refused to unpack for years, insecurities, long-forgotten dreams, little bits of shame. Every relationship you have is like someone reaching into that backpack and pulling something out. Sometimes it's a gift. Other times it's something you'd rather no one saw. And yet, until you start unpacking it yourself, you'll keep meeting people who do it for you. I think about this every time I feel a flash of irritation or admiration for someone. Instead of asking, why are they like that? I try to ask, why is this making me feel this way? It's not easy. My first instinct is still to roll my eyes or romanticize them completely. But slowly, I've learned those strong emotional reactions are my own personal signposts. They're pointing toward parts of myself that need a little more attention, maybe even a little more love. The realization hit me like a slow sunrise. If I keep blaming the mirrors for what they show me, I'll never change the image. So now, when someone shows up in my life and stirs the waters, whether they make me feel small, powerful, frustrated, or adored, I try to see it as an invitation, not to change them, but to see myself more clearly. And maybe that's the whole point of these mirrors we call relationships. They're not here to flatter us or shame us, but to bring us closer to who we really are. And if that's true, then maybe the question isn't, why is this happening to me? But what part of me is this here to show? There was a time when I thought I had my life neatly organized, like one of those tidy Pinterest kitchens where every jar has a label. But relationships, real ones, not the glossy social media kind, have a way of taking those neatly labeled jars and shaking them until the contents spill everywhere. It's unsettling at first, watching your tidy categories blur together. But if you look closely, you start to see patterns you'd never noticed before. One of the earliest patterns I caught in myself was my tendency to be drawn to people who, for lack of a better word, intimidated me. They were charismatic, sure of themselves, able to walk into a room and make it theirs without even trying. I told myself I admired them, and I did. But there was also a faint edge of resentment hiding under that admiration, as if they had stolen a confidence I should have had. It wasn't until years later that I realized they weren't stealing it. I had just locked my own confidence in a cupboard and forgotten the key. Old age wisdom says, what you resist persists. And it's true, I spent years resisting that kind of energy in myself, only to keep attracting people who forced me to face it. A quirky fact here. Apparently, when we're attracted to someone, our pupils dilate ever so slightly. And when we're irritated, they do the exact same thing. Which means you could be glaring at someone and your eyes are still betraying you by lighting up like fairy lights. Academics might frame this as a tension between our conscious identity and our unconscious desires. Personally, I think it's proof the body is in on the joke before the mind catches up. I once dated someone who was my complete opposite in every practical way. I was cautious, they were impulsive. I made lists. They lost their keys twice a week. At first, it felt like the perfect balance. They brought spontaneity into my life, I brought stability into theirs. But over time, I realized I wasn't just attracted to their spontaneity, I was dependent on it. It was as if I had outsourced my sense of adventure, letting them live out the parts of me I was too nervous to claim. When the relationship ended, I was left not only with heartbreak, but with the uncomfortable awareness that I had abandoned my own ability to be bold. Looking back, it's almost comical how often we hand over the job of living certain parts of our lives to other people. We think it's compatibility, when really, it's avoidance. The mirror they hold up isn't just about what you already are. Sometimes, it's about what you've refused to be. There's a story I like to tell about an old neighbor of mine, a retired sailor with a face like leather and a laugh like gravel. He used to say, "You can't chart a new course if you're still sailing by someone else's stars." At the time, I thought he was talking about ships. Now I see he was talking about people, how easy it is to navigate by someone else's light instead of finding your own. That's the uncomfortable academic truth about attraction and repulsion. Both are driven by an inner compass you may not fully understand. The needle doesn't just point north, it points toward your unclaimed traits, your unfinished stories, your quiet longings. And until you learn to sail by that, you'll keep mistaking other people's journeys for your own. These days, when someone walks into my life and captures my attention, whether by inspiring me or annoying me, I try to pause and ask, is this about them or is this about me? More often than not, it's about me. It's about something I've left behind, or something I've been afraid to step into. Sometimes it's even about a part of me I've been pretending doesn't exist. And here's the part no one tells you. It's not always pleasant to reclaim those pieces. Sometimes stepping into your own confidence makes you feel like an imposter. Sometimes taking back your adventurous streak makes you clumsy at first. But the more you do it, the less you need other people to carry those traits for you. It's like discovering you've had a spare key to that cupboard all along, the one where you locked away parts of yourself. You dust it off. Open the door. And yes, maybe it's a bit messy in there, but it's yours. And the more you own it, the less power those old mirrors have over you. It's funny, once you start paying attention to your emotional reactions, the world becomes this endless hall of mirrors. Every conversation, every offhand comment, every glance from across the room feels like a reflection of something deeper. At first, it's exhausting. You start wondering if you're secretly in a never-ending therapy session you didn't sign up for. But over time, you realize that these reflections aren't punishments. They're invitations. I remember sitting in a cafe one rainy Tuesday, minding my own business, when a couple at the next table began arguing. Not shouting, just that tight, controlled tone, where every syllable is like a blade. I had no stake in it, yet my shoulders tensed as if I were part of the fight. That was the moment I realized that emotional triggers don't need a direct connection. If they touch an old nerve, your body reacts like it's happening to you. Here's where old age wisdom slips in again. You can't heal what you won't feel. It's uncomfortable, but true. Most of us try to sidestep our emotional triggers the way you'd avoid a pothole on a rainy night, but they're not going away. Each trigger is essentially a road sign pointing to something inside you that's still unfinished. A quirky fact. Scientists say that our bodies react to emotional pain in the same way they do to physical injury. The brain doesn't distinguish much between a breakup and a broken bone, which is why, perhaps, A casual comment can sting just as much as a stubbed toe, except you can't put a plaster on a bruised ego. The academic types call it social pain overlap theory, which sounds sterile, but really it's about how deeply connected our sense of self is to our relationships. There was a time when I mistook my reactions to others as simple personality clashes. Oh, I just don't get along with people like that, I'd say, as if it were about them being difficult. But the truth's, most of the time, they were doing something I did myself, only they were doing it out loud. The arrogance I couldn't stand in others was the same arrogance I buried under false modesty. The coldness I accused others of was the emotional distance I kept for my own safety. It's humbling, realizing that the traits we hate in others are often exaggerated versions of our own hidden habits. And yes, it's slightly annoying too. There's a comfort in thinking it's all their fault. It keeps your ego snug and unbothered. But the moment you flip the mirror, you see yourself staring back, and there's no unseeing it. I had a friend once who loved pointing out when I was being too controlled. It drove me up the wall. Who was she to decide how I should behave? Then one day, watching her have an unfiltered emotional outburst at a party, I realized something. My irritation wasn't about her lack of control. It was about my fear of losing mine. I envied her ability to just be messy, to speak without over-editing, and once I admitted that, I stopped judging her so harshly. I even started letting myself slip a little, just to see what would happen. Spoiler: the world didn't end. That's the odd thing about these emotional mirrors. The moment you name what they're showing you, the intensity fades, the couple arguing in the cafe. Now, I'd probably just sip my tea and think, there's my old discomfort with confrontation. Waving hello, the trigger doesn't disappear overnight, but it loses its ability to hijack you, and maybe that's the heart of it, not erasing the things that unsettle you, but learning to hold them without letting them run the show. It's like being backstage at your own mind, seeing all the props and pulleys that make the performance happen. Once you understand the machinery, you can choose whether to keep the act going or change the script entirely. Some patterns in life don't just knock politely on your door, they barge in, sit down on your sofa, and start eating your biscuits as if they own the place. You've probably noticed them in your relationships. The same arguments playing out with different people, the same type of partner appearing in new packaging, the same emotional script repeating itself so precisely you could swear it's déjà vu. When I first started noticing these loops, I felt a bit cursed. Like I'd accidentally signed up for a subscription service called Recurring Relationship Drama and forgotten to cancel it. But it's not magic. And it's not bad luck. It's the subconscious doing what it does best, keeping us in the familiar. Even if the familiar is slightly miserable, old age wisdom has something to say about this. What you don't heal will repeat. And in my experience, that's less of a warning and more of a guarantee. The mind seeks what it knows. If chaos feels like home, you'll find it. If you grew up learning that love came with conditions, you'll keep gravitating toward people who make you earn it. It's not about masochism, it's about comfort zones. Sometimes comfort zones are built out of discomfort, but they're still ours. Here's a quirky side note for you. Apparently, pigeons can recognize themselves in a mirror, which scientists say is a sign of self-awareness. Humans, however, can spend decades staring metaphorically into mirrors without really seeing themselves. Which makes me wonder, are pigeons quietly ahead of us in the self-reflection game? The academic term for this repetitive cycle is attachment patterning, a phrase that sounds neat and clinical until you realize it's basically a polite way of saying, you keep dating the same emotional template in a different body. And the thing about templates is, they don't change themselves. You have to redesign them. For me, it always started with the same feeling, a rush of intensity at the start, like I'd found a missing puzzle piece. But here's the thing about puzzle pieces. Sometimes they fit, because they're from the same broken set you've been carrying around for years. That initial high wasn't magic, it was recognition. My subconscious clocking, yes, this dynamic again. We know how to suffer in this one. The real turning point came when I stopped asking, why do I always meet people like this? And started asking, why do I keep choosing people like this? That's a much more uncomfortable question. Because it demands you admit you're not just an innocent bystander, you're the casting director, you're hiring the same character for the same role in your life's play. Breaking that pattern felt, at first, like learning a new language. My emotional instincts still pulled me toward what I knew, But I began noticing the red flags sooner, not as red, screaming warnings, but as quiet little whispers. Things like, haven't we done this before? Or does this excitement feel a little too familiar? And yes, I messed it up at first. I picked the safe version of the same dynamic, thinking I was making progress. But the subconscious is clever. It knows how to repackage the same old wound in fresh wrapping paper, which is why awareness alone isn't enough. You have to actually rewire your responses. One practical trick that helped was slowing down, not rushing into the emotional deep end. My old self would cannonball in on day 3. Now, I tried dipping a toe, then a foot. Then maybe having a sandwich before I decide whether to swim. It's not as cinematic, but it's a lot less exhausting. And slowly, the magic of the unfamiliar began to grow on me. It turns out, calmness can feel thrilling once you stop confusing it with boredom. Someone treating you well, consistently, without the roller coaster, isn't dull, it's revolutionary. You just have to stick with it long enough for your nervous system to recalibrate. The patterns don't vanish overnight. Sometimes they sneak back in wearing a disguise. But each time you catch them earlier, each time you choose differently, you weaken the old script's hold on you, and maybe that's the whole point, not to erase the past, but to stop letting it write your future. If there's one thing I've learned about love, it's that the people who trigger you the most aren't random, they're walking, talking mirrors. They don't just reflect the version of you you like to see in the bathroom each morning. No, they reflect the bits you've stuffed into mental cupboards, slammed the door on, and hoped no one would notice. It's unnerving when it happens. You meet someone, and within minutes they've managed to hit an emotional nerve you didn't even know existed. Maybe they make you feel small without saying a word. Maybe they're so unapologetically confident it borders on arrogance, and you find yourself grinding your teeth. Either way, that discomfort is rarely about them. It's a flare signaling there's something within you that's being poked awake. Old age wisdom phrases it as, when you point one finger, 3 point back at you, which, if we're being honest, is incredibly annoying when you'd rather just blame them. But the truth is, our strongest reactions, whether attraction or irritation, are like breadcrumbs leading to the parts of ourselves we've ignored, denied, or outright rejected. Here's a quirky fact to lighten it. Apparently, sea otters hold hands while they sleep to avoid drifting apart. Humans, on the other hand, can sleep perfectly still and still manage to drift miles apart emotionally. Go figure. Psychologists have a term for this mirroring process, projection. In simple terms, your mind is putting on a puppet show, casting someone else in a role that actually belongs to an unacknowledged part of you. The frustrating bit? The more you deny that part, the more life will keep casting guest stars to play it for you. I remember dating someone who had a knack for making grand, bold statements in public, things I found borderline embarrassing. I chalked it up to arrogance, but eventually realized it was more about my discomfort with my own voice. I'd spent years playing it safe, avoiding attention. Their self-assuredness wasn't the enemy, it was the exact trait I'd buried in myself. And the same works in reverse. I once met someone who was so painfully indecisive it drove me up the wall. Only later did I see that I was projecting my own fear of making the wrong choice. Better to blame them than admit I was scared to commit to anything that couldn't be undone. The trick, I've found, is to swap the question, why are they like this, for what is this showing me about myself? It doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it does shift the focus from powerless frustration to empowered curiosity. And yes, this is hard work. It's a lot easier to say, they're the problem, and walk away. But when you do that without learning the lesson, the universe, or whatever you want to call it, has a funny way of sending another person along to play the same role. New face, same script. The wild part is, once you start owning these disowned parts, the emotional charge fades. The person who used to send you into a spiral suddenly feels less threatening. It's as if they've lost their backstage pass to your emotions. This doesn't mean you'll love everyone unconditionally after a few months of self-reflection. Some people really are just incompatible with you. But it does mean you'll be able to tell the difference between this isn't right for me and this is rubbing against a part of me I haven't made peace with yet. And let me tell you, making peace with those parts is like cleaning out that mental cupboard. It's dusty, a bit embarrassing, and you might find things you thought you'd thrown away years ago. But afterwards, the space feels lighter. You're not tripping over the same mess every time someone new walks in. So, Next time someone gets under your skin, resist the urge to slam the door and storm off. Take a breath, peek inside that cupboard, and see what's really hiding there. You might be surprised by what you find, and even more surprised by how much lighter you feel when you stop pretending it's not yours. There's a pattern I started noticing once I paid closer attention to these emotional mirrors. It wasn't just individuals here and there. It was entire types of people. Same vibe, different name. It was like my subconscious had a favorite genre, and no matter how many times I swore I'd switch the channel, I'd find myself watching the same old show with a slightly different cast. Take relationships. For instance, I used to wonder why I kept ending up with partners who were emotionally unavailable. They weren't necessarily unkind, they just had this invisible wall, and I, for reasons I couldn't quite articulate at the time, seemed to have a hobby of trying to climb over it. I'd tell myself, this time will be different, and it never was. That's the thing about patterns, they're stubborn, and they don't dissolve just because you've spotted them once. Old age wisdom puts it neatly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. I used to think fate had a twisted sense of humor. Now I realize my subconscious was simply doing what it thought was keeping me safe, seeking out the familiar. Here's a quirky fact. The human brain literally prefers what it already knows, even when what it knows is miserable. Psychologists call it the mere exposure effect. The more familiar something feels, the more we're drawn to it, even if it's objectively terrible for us. It's like choosing the same takeaway every Friday night, not because it's the best food, but because you know exactly what you're getting. I started to see that my type wasn't romantic preference, it was unhealed history. Somewhere along the line, I had learned to associate emotional distance with love, and so my brain went looking for it, like a bloodhound on a scent trail. The problem, that kind of love always kept me chasing, never arriving. It doesn't just happen in romance, either. Look at your friendships, your work relationships, even your neighbors. Are you always surrounded by people who drain you, or those who constantly need rescuing, or those who seem to compete with you for no reason? These aren't just unlucky streaks. They're patterns pointing straight at the beliefs you've been carrying about who you are and what you deserve. Breaking them is where the work gets tricky. It's not enough to just notice the pattern. You have to actively choose something new, even when the new thing feels a bit awkward or even wrong at first. I once dated someone who was actually available, open, and honest, and my first reaction, something's off. The truth was, nothing was off. They just didn't match the blueprint my subconscious was used to following. This is where a debatable academic expression comes in handy, attachment theory. The gist is that the way we bonded with our caregivers as children sets the tone for how we relate to partners later. If you learned early on that love was conditional or inconsistent, that becomes your normal, and you'll gravitate toward it in adulthood, not because it's healthy, but because it feels like home. When I finally understood this, it felt like someone had handed me the user manual for my own heart. I realized that if I didn't rewrite my idea of home, I'd keep walking into the same kind of house, different wallpaper, same cold rooms. The hardest part, sitting in the discomfort of something better. If you're used to chasing love, being loved without having to earn it feels suspicious. If you're used to chaos, calm feels boring. But here's the thing, calm isn't boring. Calm is the space where you can finally breathe without looking over your shoulder. So now, when I meet someone, I don't just ask, do I like them? I also ask, do I like who I am when I'm around them? Because that's the real test. And if the answer's no, if I shrink, twist, or perform, I know it's time to step back. No matter how tempting the pattern is, it's not about perfection. You're still going to trip over old habits sometimes. But each time you catch yourself and choose differently, you're training your brain to see new paths. And over time, those new paths become the familiar ones. And that's when the cycle truly starts to break. One thing I've learned is that triggers are not random explosions. They're like flashing neon signs pointing at something unresolved inside you. I used to think they were all about the other person, like they'd press some mysterious button only they could see. But the truth is, that button is mine. They just happened to find it. There was a colleague once who had this knack for making these tiny, almost throwaway comments about my work. Interesting approach, she'd say, in a tone that made me wonder if interesting was code for wrong. Every time, my stomach would knot, and I'd replay the conversation for hours. it wasn't about her, though it was about me. And this old belief I'd been carrying around since school, that I had to prove my worth to be accepted. She didn't plant that belief, she just watered it without meaning to. An older friend once told me, the things that make you flinch are the same things that make you grow, if you're willing to sit with them. At the time, I thought it was just the sort of poetic nonsense people say over tea, but there's something to it. Triggers are teachers, even if they feel like hecklers at first. Here's a quirky fact that might make you smirk. The amygdala, the part of the brain that handles fear, doesn't actually know the difference between a real threat and a remembered one. So if your partner's late text reply feels like a personal rejection, your amygdala might be reacting as if you've been abandoned on a deserted island, which is ridiculous. Of course, unless you're actually on a deserted island, in which case you've got bigger problems than texting. The academic term that slips in here is projection. It's the tendency to see in others what we can't or won't acknowledge in ourselves. Someone's arrogance bothers you. Maybe you've got your own streak of arrogance that you've shoved into a corner. Someone's indecisiveness drives you up the wall. Could be you've been dodging a big decision yourself. It's not a comfortable realization, but it's one of those that reshapes the way you look at people and at yourself. What I've found is that the real work isn't in avoiding triggers, it's in investigating them. The next time someone makes you bristle, instead of asking, why are they like this? Try asking, why does this land so hard for me? It's not about excusing bad behavior, it's about reclaiming the power you hand over when you let someone else's actions dictate your state of mind. It's also about making friends with parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Once, during a workshop, we were asked to write a letter to a trait we hated in ourselves. Mine was impatience. I ended up thanking it, yes, actually thanking it, for pushing me to take action in moments where hesitation might have cost me opportunities. Did I want impatience running the whole show? Absolutely not. But could I see its value when balanced? Yes. That tiny shift made me less reactive when I saw impatience in others. Here's the thing. Integration doesn't mean you suddenly love all your flaws. It means you stop pretending they don't exist, which ironically makes them easier to manage. And as you integrate those rejected parts, the people who used to get under your skin lose some of their sting. It's like diffusing a bomb. You can still see the wires, but they're no longer live. The payoff. Your relationships change, not necessarily because other people do, but because you're no longer bringing the same unexamined baggage to the table. I've had friendships deepen simply because I stopped making everything they said or did about me. That's the hidden magic here. The more you understand yourself, the less other people's behavior controls you. So now, when I'm triggered, I try to treat it like a curious scientist rather than a judge. I ask questions. I jot things down. I even talk to that part of me that's hurting, like it's a friend who just got startled. It sounds a bit mad, but honestly, it works. Over time, those neon signs don't flash quite so often, and when they do, they feel more like invitations than warnings. There's something strangely comforting about patterns, even the ones that hurt us. I've noticed how easy it is to confuse familiar with safe, as if my nervous system has decided that what I've known the longest must somehow be good for me. Spoiler alert, it's not always true. In fact, it's often the opposite. I used to date the same personality type over and over, just wearing different clothes and using different slang. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, or maybe just my type, but if my type kept leaving me feeling drained, anxious, and slightly smaller than I was before, then perhaps my type was really just my history playing dress up. An old mentor once told me, your history has a flavor, and you'll keep ordering the same dish until you learn the recipe. At the time, I laughed, but the metaphor stuck. The relationships that felt most magnetic were often the ones that tasted familiar, an echo of my childhood dynamics, both the sweet and the bitter. Here's a quirky little truth from neuroscience. Your brain has something called the default mode network, which loves routine because it burns less energy. So yes, you might literally be wired to prefer the devil, which explains why some people leave one bad relationship only to end up in another eerily similar one. The brain's logic is, well, at least we know the exits here. Unfortunately, emotional familiarity isn't the same thing as emotional safety. The academic phrase that comes to mind here is attachment style. It's not destiny, but it's a strong gravitational pull. If you grew up learning that love was unpredictable, You might now subconsciously seek out partners who are inconsistent. It's not that you enjoy the chaos, it's that part of you recognizes the rhythm and mistakes recognition for compatibility. I remember once being in a coffee shop, watching a couple at the next table. They barely spoke, except for occasional, sharp remarks. I caught myself thinking, they seem so comfortable together, before realizing that comfort was just my projection. My mind was reading their silence as stability, when in reality it was more likely resignation. It made me wonder how often I'd mistaken stillness for peace in my own life. Breaking these patterns is less like slamming on the brakes and more like slowly learning to steer differently. For me, it began with asking ridiculously blunt questions of myself. If this person didn't remind me of anyone, would I still be attracted to them? Do I like who I am when I'm with them? Or do I shrink? One old piece of wisdom that rings true here is this: the lesson will keep showing up until you learn it. It's irritating because it's true. Each repeated pattern is like a teacher who refuses to let you graduate until you've understood the material. The faces change, the context changes, but the emotional homework remains the same. Something unexpected happens when you start choosing differently. It can feel uncomfortable, even boring at first. I remember starting to date someone who was calm, consistent, and genuinely kind. Part of me thought, where's the spark, the drama, the roller coaster? It took a while to understand that what I was really feeling was the absence of chaos, and that absence was a good thing, even if it felt foreign. So now, when I notice myself leaning towards the familiar, I pause. I ask whether I'm drawn to this because it's healthy, or because it's what my nervous system recognizes. Sometimes the answer isn't pretty, but every time I choose the unfamiliar, if it's healthier, I'm rewiring something deep. It's a bit like teaching an old dog new tricks. Possible, but it takes patience, treats, and the occasional nap. The beauty of shifting these patterns is that the relationships you form begin to reflect the person you're becoming, not just the person you've been. And that's worth every awkward, uncomfortable first step. There's a peculiar trick the mind plays when it's not ready to let go of a wound. It disguises the wound as preference. I used to think I just liked people who were a little hard to reach, the ones who kept a part of themselves locked away. It felt mysterious, romantic even. But if I was honest, it was also exhausting. The truth is, I wasn't chasing mystery, I was chasing the hope that this time I'd finally be let in. It's a bit like repeatedly trying the same locked door, because you once heard it leads to a hidden garden. Eventually, you realize you've been living in the corridor, waiting for a key that never comes. And meanwhile, whole rooms of your life remain unexplored. There's a piece of old wisdom I once heard from an elderly neighbor who'd been married for 50 years. Love isn't about finding the right door, it's about building the right house together. At the time, I thought it sounded quaint. Now, I understand it was a masterclass in choosing presence over pursuit. A quirky side note for you: did you know that studies in behavioral psychology show that intermittent rewards are more addictive than consistent ones? That's why slot machines hook people so effectively. And it's also why relationships with inconsistent affection can feel so intoxicating. Your brain gets hooked on the high of uncertainty, on the unpredictable win. The academic term here is variable ratio reinforcement. It's why those unpredictable bursts of attention from someone can feel more powerful than steady affection. You end up mistaking adrenaline for love, when in reality, it's closer to a gambler's rush. I remember a particular relationship where I was constantly trying to decode messages, both literal texts and the unspoken ones. One day, they'd be warm and engaging. The next, distant and unreadable. I'd tell myself, they're just busy, or they're deep in thought. But my body told a different story. My shoulders were always tense, my sleep was restless, and my mind never stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations. Looking back, it wasn't romance, it was self-abandonment in the name of connection. That's the thing about chasing emotionally unavailable people. It demands you abandon your own emotional needs to maintain the illusion of closeness. Breaking that habit took deliberate effort. I started by noticing how my body responded to people. Did I feel grounded and calm around them? Or was I constantly on alert, scanning for shifts in mood or tone? The more I paid attention, the more I realized that real compatibility feels like quiet steadiness, not emotional cliff edges. An old saying from my grandmother comes to mind: if you have to keep knocking, maybe it's not your door. I used to roll my eyes at her folk wisdom, but now I see it as a gentle reminder that love shouldn't require you to prove you're worthy of entry. Choosing differently meant learning to resist the gravitational pull of inconsistency. It meant finding joy in relationships that didn't keep me guessing, in the kind of love that doesn't need a dramatic soundtrack to feel alive. At first, it was unnerving, like walking on solid ground after years at sea. But over time, I began to recognize that safety and boredom are not the same thing. Now, when someone's affection feels unpredictable, I pause. I remind myself that I'm not here to be a detective or a locksmith. I'm here to be met fully, without games or guesswork. And slowly, I've come to see that the most extraordinary thing about real love is how wonderfully ordinary it can be. Steady mornings, predictable kindness, and the quiet comfort of knowing where you stand. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we tend to carry unspoken contracts into our relationships, agreements we never actually discussed but silently expect the other person to honor. For years, I was guilty of this. I'd walk into a relationship with a mental list of things the other person should just know. And when they didn't deliver, I'd feel hurt, even betrayed. It's like inviting someone to play a game you invented in your head, but never explaining the rules, and then getting upset when they lose. In hindsight, I can laugh at the absurdity of it, but at the time, it felt deadly serious. My expectations weren't random, they were stitched together from childhood experiences, old heartbreaks, and half-remembered love stories. An elderly shopkeeper once told me, "The problem isn't that people don't love you, it's that they don't love you in the way you expect." At first, I thought she was talking about romance, but she meant every kind of relationship, and she was right. People often express care in ways that have nothing to do with our personal love language. Here's a quirky fact. In Japanese culture, there's a concept called ame, which refers to the unspoken presumption of being cared for. It's woven into relationships without being openly stated. The thing is, ame works best when both parties intuitively understand the dynamic. When they don't, it can turn into a recipe for disappointment. Exactly what happens when our hidden contracts aren't mutually agreed upon. The academic term for this is implicit relational schemas. It's essentially the mental blueprint you carry for how relationships should work, based on past experiences. The problem, these blueprints are often outdated or incompatible with someone else's design. In one relationship, I expected daily check-ins, a good morning text, maybe a quick "how's your day?" By my measure, it was the bare minimum. To my partner, it felt like an obligation, a box to tick rather than a heartfelt gesture. We weren't wrong about what connection meant. We were just reading from different manuals. This is where the silent contract becomes dangerous. It creates a constant undercurrent of unspoken resentment. You're upset, but you don't feel you can explain why without sounding needy or demanding. Meanwhile, the other person is unaware they've broken a rule they never agreed to follow. Breaking that cycle required a dose of humility. I had to admit that my way wasn't the only way, and that maybe my expectations weren't universal truths, but deeply personal preferences. The turning point came when I stopped assuming and started articulating. Instead of silently hoping for a specific gesture, I'd say, "It means a lot to me when you check in during the day. It makes me feel connected." It's remarkable how much smoother things run when you actually let people know what you need. An old friend once compared it to gardening. You can't get upset that the roses aren't blooming if you never told anyone you planted them. That stuck with me. Now, I try to see my relationships as collaborative gardens, not private projects, of course. This doesn't mean lowering your standards or pretending you don't have needs. It's about recognizing that unspoken rules are unfair to everyone involved. Love doesn't need to be a guessing game. It thrives best when you both agree on how to play. These days, when I catch myself slipping back into old patterns, I stop and ask, have I actually said this out loud? If the answer is no, I make it a point to speak up. And more often than not, the other person appreciates the clarity. Because in the end, the most important contract in any relationship isn't the one you never mention. It's the one you both sign willingly, with eyes wide open. One of the most humbling discoveries I've made is that sometimes the thing I crave most from others is the very thing I withhold from myself. I used to think I was simply unlucky in love, always ending up with people who couldn't give me what I needed. But eventually, I had to face the uncomfortable truth. I was asking them to hand me something I refused to cultivate within. It's a bit like expecting someone to pour water into your cup while you're holding it upside down. You might not notice the problem at first, you just think they're pouring wrong, but deep down, you're the one preventing it from filling. I remember a time when I longed for reassurance, for someone to tell me I was enough just as I was. Yet, on the rare occasions when I did receive that affirmation, it never seemed to stick. Compliments slid right off me like rain on a waxed coat. Why? Because I didn't believe them. I was so committed to my inner script of not enough that even when love came knocking, I left it on the porch. There's a lovely old saying, something my grandmother used to repeat: "You can't drink from a cracked cup." It sounds poetic, but it's painfully practical. If you don't repair the fractures inside, nothing you receive from others will ever feel complete. Here's a quirky fact for you. There's a psychological term called hedonic adaptation, which basically means we get used to good things faster than we realize. That big emotional boost you get from external validation fades quickly, leaving you craving the next hit. It's the same principle that makes the first bite of cake glorious, but the third just cake. Academically speaking, this ties into what's known as self-concept congruence, the idea that we filter incoming information through what we already believe about ourselves. If someone tells you you're wonderful, but your self-image says otherwise, your brain quietly files that compliment under does not apply. For me, the turning point came during a quiet walk one evening. I'd just had an argument with someone I cared about, and my first instinct was to replay all the ways they'd failed to meet my needs. But halfway through my mental rant, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd truly offered myself the same kindness I was demanding from them. When was the last time I told myself I was doing well, that I was worthy? I honestly couldn't say. So I began a small, slightly awkward experiment. Every morning, I'd say something encouraging to myself in the mirror. At first, it felt ridiculous, like I was auditioning for a low-budget self-help video, but gradually, it began to feel normal. And the more I practiced it, the less I felt desperate for others to say it for me. This doesn't mean I stopped appreciating affirmation from others. Far from it. It just meant I no longer treated it like oxygen. It became a bonus rather than a lifeline. And funnily enough, the less I demanded constant reassurance, the more freely it seemed to come. An old friend put it perfectly over coffee one day. You stopped coming to the table empty, so people stopped feeling like they had to feed you first. That's exactly what it felt like, shifting from a place of scarcity to one of shared abundance. Now, whenever I feel that creeping sense of lack in a relationship, I pause and ask myself, am I already giving myself what I'm asking from them? If the answer is no, that's my starting point. Because I've learned that love from others feels richest when it lands on soil I've already been tending myself. It's strange how the smallest encounters can sometimes shine the brightest light on the biggest truths. A few months ago, I was in a little cafe I often haunt on rainy afternoons. The kind with mismatched chairs and a slightly wobbly table I always choose anyway. A couple at the next table were having what I can only describe as the gentlest argument I'd ever overheard. Soft voices, small hand gestures, like they were both afraid of scaring away the coffee steam. The woman said, "I just wish you'd notice when I'm struggling." The man paused, stirred his cup, and replied, "I thought you didn't want me to fuss." They weren't angry, they were lost in translation. It hit me right there. So many relationship struggles aren't about malice or indifference, but about mismatched interpretations of care. We expect others to read our internal dictionary without ever handing them a copy. When I think about my own past relationships, I see this pattern everywhere. I'd drop hints instead of speaking plainly. I'd hope they'd notice my tired eyes or my forced smile. And when they didn't, I'd quietly decide they didn't care. In reality, they just didn't have the information they needed. There's a proverb I once read in a dusty old bookshop: "A closed mouth gathers no feet." It made me laugh, but it's true. If you never speak your needs, you can't accuse someone of failing to meet them. The trouble is, speaking up often feels risky. What if they reject you? What if they dismiss it? Here's the quirky fact. Linguists have studied how couples communicate, and they found that indirect requests are far more likely to be misunderstood. Saying, "It's cold in here," might lead your partner to nod in agreement rather than offer you a blanket. Whereas saying, "Could you bring me a blanket?" has about a 97% higher success rate. Obvious, yet revolutionary. From an academic perspective, this ties into something called interpersonal clarity, the degree to which our intended message matches the message that's received. Low clarity means room for assumptions, and assumptions are where resentments breed like damp in an old house. One of the hardest lessons for me was learning to pair vulnerability with precision. Saying, "I feel overlooked when you don't ask how my day went," is far more constructive than, "You never care about me." The first invites understanding, the second invites defensiveness. Old age wisdom comes in handy here too. My grandfather used to say, "If you want a loaf, ask for bread, not for someone to guess your hunger." He had a knack for cutting through sentimentality to get to the point. And I found that advice applies to almost every connection I have. When I started being more direct, not demanding, not over-explaining, just clear, I noticed my relationships shifting. Friends, partners, even colleagues seemed more responsive, not because they suddenly cared more, but because I'd finally given them a roadmap. And here's the quiet magic. When you communicate your needs openly, you also give the other person permission to do the same. It stops being a guessing game and starts being a collaboration. Of course, there's always the risk they won't meet you halfway. That's where self-trust comes in. The belief that you can handle disappointment without crumbling. I've found that when I'm rooted in my own self-worth, I can speak my needs without fear of losing someone. Nowadays, I try to treat conversations about needs like I'm placing an order at a favorite cafe. You ask for what you want. You hope they have it. But if they don't, you decide whether to choose something else or try another place. You don't set fire to the menu or storm out. I think about that couple in the cafe sometimes. I like to imagine that after their coffee, they walked home under the same umbrella, maybe even laughed about the whole thing. Because most of the time, the gap between us and the love we want isn't a wall. It's just a translation problem waiting for a little clarity. There's a certain kind of quiet that follows a broken connection, not the loud, crashing kind of breakup where voices rise and doors slam, but the slow, almost imperceptible drifting apart. I've experienced both, but it's the silent endings that haunt me most. They don't come with closure, just a lingering echo of what wasn't said. I remember one friendship in particular. We'd known each other for over a decade, a bond built on late-night talks, borrowed jumpers, and the unspoken assumption we'd always be there for each other. Then, little by little, we stopped calling. Messages sat unanswered for days, then weeks. Eventually, the silence became normal. The academic in me can't help but analyze it. Social psychologists call this relational decay, a gradual erosion caused not by one catastrophic event, but by a failure to maintain the small, sustaining rituals. It's like a garden you stop watering. The plants don't die overnight, but slowly, quietly, they wilt. And here's a quirky fact. Anthropologists studying community bonds found that relationships, even strong ones, start to weaken after about 3 months of no contact. The human brain, it seems, needs fresh signals to keep someone in the close category. Without them, even the fondest memories fade into background noise. For me, the realization came late. I'd catch myself thinking, I should message her, but then I'd tell myself I was too busy, or that she should reach out first.
Pride masquerading as dignity, an old age wisdom trap I've seen play out countless times in others.
My grandmother used to warn, waiting for the other person to fix it is like staring at a kettle and wondering why it's not boiling when you haven't turned on the stove. Looking back, I can see how fear played its part. Fear of being the only one still invested. Fear of finding out the bond wasn't as strong as I thought, so I stayed silent, convincing myself I was being respectful of her space when really, I was avoiding vulnerability. The thing is, most relationships don't end with a bang, they end with a shrug. A slow accumulation of missed opportunities to reconnect. A failure to say, "Hey, I miss you," or "I noticed we haven't talked in a while. Are you okay?" It's never just the big fights that kill intimacy, it's the little absences left unaddressed. There's an old proverb from somewhere in Eastern Europe, "The rope breaks where it's thinnest." In relationships, that thin spot is often the space where communication has been neglected. And once it snaps, you can tie it back together. But the knot remains, a reminder of the break. In my more reflective moments, I think about how many people are walking around right now with ghost friendships, ghost loves, ghost family connections. We carry them in the corners of our minds, telling ourselves we'll reach out one day. But one day is the most deceptive phrase in the language. When I started paying attention to these silent endings, I made a quiet rule for myself. If someone crosses my mind twice in 1 week, I reach out. No overthinking. No, what if it's awkward? Just a simple, hey, you popped into my head. How's life? More often than not, the response is warm, sometimes even tinged with relief because they were thinking the same thing. The wisdom here is simple but hard. Maintaining connection is an active choice, not a passive hope. If you want someone in your life, you have to keep showing up, even in small ways, especially in small ways. I still don't know if that old friend and I could rebuild what we had. Maybe too much time has passed, but I do know this: if I could go back, I wouldn't wait for her to make the first move. I'd send the message, make the call, knock on the door, because when love, in any form, is slipping quietly away, silence is never neutral. It's the final nail in the coffin, hammered in one unspoken moment at a time. It's funny how people imagine closure as a neatly wrapped package, a conversation, an apology, maybe even a mutual agreement to part ways with no hard feelings. In reality, closure often comes disguised as an unanswered question, and the only person who can give it to you is yourself. I learned this the hard way. There was a relationship I clung to long past its expiration date, holding on to the idea that if I could just get an explanation, the ache in my chest would fade. But explanations are slippery things. Even when you get them, they rarely satisfy in the way you imagine. It's like expecting the last piece of a puzzle to make the whole picture perfect, only to find the colors still don't quite match. One late night, scrolling through an online psychology forum, I stumbled upon a concept called ambiguous loss. It's used to describe situations where the relationship is gone, but the person is still alive, physically present somewhere in the world, but emotionally unreachable. The mind struggles with it because there's no clear event to file away in the finished folder. It lingers, unresolved. Here's a quirky fact that amused and unsettled me in equal measure. Neuroscientists have found that the brain processes social rejection in the same neural pathways as physical pain. That's why a simple scene with no reply can feel like a punch in the gut. It literally lights up the same regions, which, in hindsight, makes my slightly dramatic reaction to being ghosted seem marginally more justified. The old age wisdom here, my father's version, was blunt. You won't always get the answers you want, and you don't need them to move on. It annoyed me when he said it. I wanted steps, a plan, a guaranteed path to feeling better. Instead, he was handing me the uncomfortable truth that healing isn't about tying up loose ends. It's about learning to live with a few threads left dangling. And he was right. When I stopped waiting for closure from the other person, something shifted. I started creating my own rituals for release. Sometimes it was as small as deleting an old chat thread. Other times it was writing a letter I never sent, pouring out every question, every frustration, every fond memory, and then tearing it into pieces. Dramatic. Perhaps effective. Absolutely. There's an academic debate about whether closure is a real psychological need or a cultural construct. Some argue we're biologically driven to seek resolution because our brains like complete narratives. It's less energy to store a finished story than an open-ended one. Others believe it's a learned expectation, fueled by books, films, and the constant happily ever after messaging. I'm inclined to think it's both, which is probably why people spend years chasing it. But here's the thing, they often chase it in the wrong direction. We tell ourselves we'll feel better once they answer, once they apologize, once they admit their part. Yet even if that happens, the relief is temporary. The real work is internal, deciding that your peace is worth more than their explanation. I remember the exact moment this clicked for me. I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at my phone, debating whether to send another message to an ex-friend, and it hit me. I wasn't waiting for her to answer my question. I was waiting for her to validate my worth. That's when I realized closure wasn't something she could give me. It had to come from deciding, on my own, that the story was done. So I began rewriting the endings in my head, not to erase what happened, but to reclaim it. Instead of "she left without saying goodbye," I reframed it as "our paths diverged, and I wish her well." It's not about pretending it didn't hurt. It's about refusing to let the pain be the final word. Now, when people leave my life, I try to see it less as a loss and more as a transition. Some relationships are chapters, not the whole book. And just because someone isn't in the next chapter doesn't mean their role in the story wasn't important. I still don't have all the answers for why some endings are clean and others are jagged. But I do know this: waiting for someone else to stitch the wound keeps it open. Choosing to close it yourself, even imperfectly, is the only way it truly heals. There's a quiet kind of power in deciding that you're done, not in a flippant, I don't care way, but in the deep, almost sacred sense of choosing peace over chaos. For years, I thought letting go meant losing, that if I stopped trying, it was the same as admitting defeat. But I've learned that letting go is not about giving up, it's about giving yourself back. One of the most vivid memories I have of this realization was on a gray Sunday afternoon. I was walking through the park, damp leaves sticking to my shoes, the air sharp with the smell of rain-soaked earth. I saw a child struggling to untangle a kite string from a branch. His father stood nearby, smiling gently, and after a few moments said, "Sometimes you just have to cut it free. Mechi." There was something about that moment, a simple truth dressed up as casual advice, that lodged itself in my mind. Cutting free is terrifying. It's the moment you admit that the thing you've been holding on to might never be what you want it to be. It's also liberating in ways you can't fully explain until you do it. Because the space left behind isn't empty. It's full of possibilities you couldn't see when you were staring at the same stubborn knot. Here's a quirky fact that always makes me smile. The Japanese have a concept called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, making the cracks part of the object's beauty. It's the opposite of pretending nothing happened. Instead, the damage is honored as part of its history. I think people are the same. The cracks don't make us less, they make us more interesting, more real. An old neighbor of mine, Mrs. Whitaker, used to say, "Don't spend your life sweeping the same dusty corner when the whole house needs living in." She was talking about relationships without realizing it. I think we get so caught up in the one thing that hurt us, the one person we couldn't hold on to, that we forget there's a whole life waiting for us outside that tiny, dusty corner. There's an ongoing academic argument about whether humans are naturally resilient or if resilience has to be cultivated. Personally, I think it's both. Life gives us cracks. We decide whether to fill them with gold or with bitterness. The former takes more work, but it's also the only way to carry those cracks without them cutting into you every time you move. I've had people tell me they could never let go of someone because the memories are too strong. And I get it, memories can feel like anchors. But anchors don't just hold ships in place, they can also stop them from sailing to better waters. Letting go doesn't erase what happened, it simply stops it from dictating what happens next. In the end, I realized that the most profound relationships I've had were never about permanence. They were about impact. Some people are like shooting stars, brief, dazzling, and gone before you can catch your breath. Others are like the moon, constant, even if they go through phases, and both have their place in the night sky. The final piece of wisdom I've taken from all this: stop waiting for perfect timing, perfect people, or perfect words. If you're holding on to something that's hurting more than it's helping, cut it free, not out of spite, but out of love for yourself and, strangely enough, for them too, because holding on out of fear or habit traps you both in the past. So now, when someone leaves my life, I don't chase them down. I wish them well, sometimes silently, sometimes out loud. I trust that whatever role they played, however brief or long, mattered in the moment it existed, and I remind myself that the most important relationship I'll ever have is with me, the one person guaranteed to be there for every single chapter of the story. And maybe, just maybe, the real magic of letting go is discovering that you were never really losing anything. You were making space for something new to arrive. And so, as we drift towards the end of this journey, let the noise soften, the pace slow, and the words stretch out into the spaces between your thoughts. You've walked with me through the hidden corners of the heart, through shadows and mirrors, through the quiet work of mending and releasing. We've seen how love isn't something we stumble upon. It's something we build, piece by piece, in the way we speak to ourselves, in the way we choose who and what to hold close, and in the courage it takes to let go. The cracks in us are not failures, but the gold-veined proof that we have lived, tried, and grown. Whatever you carry now, whether it's tenderness, sadness, or the lightness of relief, let it settle without judgment. You are allowed to take up space in your own life, to love without needing permission, and to step forward without carrying the weight of every yesterday. Let the rest fall away for tonight. Breathe, rest, and remember, you are already whole, and you always have been. Sleep well.